Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, autumn of 1987. The morning light crawls slowly across cracked sidewalks and old brick buildings, casting long, golden shadows on the worn facades of a city still bearing the weight of lost industry, shifting memory, and silent men who never fully returned from wars that ended long ago. On the corner of Liberty Avenue and 25th Street, long before the first bus groans past and the smell of fried eggs floats out from the diner windows, an old man in a dark wool cap appears. Always alone, always early, always sweeping. The neighborhood kids call him Mr. Leon, though no one is quite sure if that's his real name or just a nickname someone started years ago. He never speaks. He doesn't look you in the eye. He wears the same heavy coat no matter the season, and his broom moves with a kind of practiced rhythm, as if he's not so much cleaning the streets as tracing lines in the dust of history, lines no one else can see. To the people around here, he's simply part of the city's aging landscape, like the rusted fire hydrants, the broken benches in Arsenal Park, or the faded American flags hanging from row house windows. Children avoid him out of unease, teenagers joke nervously when they pass him, and adults mostly ignore him, as if silence were contagious, as if getting too close might awaken something too old, too fragile, or too painful. No one knows where he lives. No one's seen him sit in church, drink at a bar, or shop for groceries. He's just there, at sunrise every day, sweeping the same sidewalks he's swept for decades, as if tethered to this patch of ground by something no one else can name. If anyone ever wondered why, they didn't ask. And if they did ask, he never answered. That is, until the day a high school history teacher named Michael Granger stumbled upon a box of recently declassified war records from a U.S. military archive. Inside, buried between faded documents and creased photographs from World War II, he found a picture, black and white, worn at the corners, showing a line of captured resistance fighters in a European town near the end of the war. Standing among them was a young man with dark eyes, high cheekbones, and a stare that cut right through the lens. A young man who looked unmistakably like Mr. Leon. The label beneath the photo read, Leon Kowalski, Polish Resistance, captured near Warsaw, 1944. Granger sat in silence, the image in his hands, heart thudding in his chest. Could it be him? The man sweeping his block every morning in silence? What story had been buried in plain sight, in dust and silence all these years? And more importantly, why had he never told anyone? If this story is touching you the way it touched me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue to share true stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. For years, maybe even decades, Leon Kowalski had existed not as a man, but as a fixture, the kind of silent, overlooked presence that cities quietly inherit and forget at the same time. He was there each morning before the delivery trucks rumbled down Butler Street, and long after the corner bakery unlocked its doors. His broom scratched across the pavement in that same familiar rhythm, sweeping up leaves and cigarette butts and broken glass, though no one could remember who had ever hired him, or if he was being paid at all. Some said he lived above the old butcher shop, though no one had ever seen him enter or leave. Others claimed he slept in the basement of St. Mary's Church, but the priest, when asked, simply shook his head, then changed the subject. In truth, no one really knew where Leon went when the sun was high and the sidewalks too crowded for silence. He seemed to vanish into brick and dust and shadow, leaving behind only the echo of bristles on concrete. There was something about him, not threatening but weighty, as if he carried with him more than the weathered broom and battered coat he wore each day. He walked like a man remembering something too painful to forget. He never made eye contact. He never lingered. He spoke to no one. When approached, he nodded once, not warmly, not coldly, but with the kind of detached acknowledgement that said, "I am here, but not with you." Dlee, in a city like Pittsburgh, still licking its wounds from the collapse of steel and the slow, aching transformation of industry to vacancy, there were many such ghosts. Men whose stories had eroded with their purpose, men who once built bridges or forged iron, and now wandered alleys with nothing but time. But Leon was different. His silence wasn't economic. It was ancient, personal, composed. The older residents remembered his arrival. Vaguely, like something whispered behind curtains. He had shown up sometime after the war, limping slightly, speaking with an accent that was hard to place. Polish, perhaps. Maybe Ukrainian. A few said he'd once worked for the city sanitation department, but had quit after just 1 year, never explaining why, simply continuing to sweep the same blocks day after day, without pay, without recognition, without complaint. Rumors floated like steam from the manhole covers in winter. Some said he had been in a labor camp. Others claimed he had lost his family. One man swore Leon had once stopped a runaway car from hitting a child, then walked away before anyone could thank him. But the truth, if it existed at all, stayed locked behind those eyes that never quite looked at you. Eyes that seemed to be watching something far away, something only he could still see. Then came the discovery. After Michael Granger, the high school history teacher, found the wartime photograph and shared it with a few trusted colleagues, the image began to move, slowly at first, like a rumor, then faster, as photocopies made their way onto bulletin boards and classroom cork walls, until eventually someone pinned it to the counter at Margie's Diner, right next to the flyer for Lost Cats and the Sunday. Bingo schedule. People began to notice, to compare, to whisper. The man in the photo, younger, thinner, standing among captured resistance fighters, had the same sharp cheekbones, the same furrowed brow, the same distant stare that Pittsburghers saw each morning hunched over a broom on Liberty Avenue. The photo's label, which identified him as a Polish resistance fighter captured in 1944, turned Mr. Leon from a background figure into a question, one that the neighborhood suddenly couldn't stop asking. Could it really be him? If so, why had he hidden it? And what else had he buried under all that silence? People began to remember things, small, strange, forgotten details that now took on new meaning. Mrs. Coleman from the flower shop recalled seeing a faded tattoo on Leon's wrist once when he rolled up his sleeve in summer. Mr. Davis, who worked the late shift at the corner gas station, said Leon always stopped at the same time each Thursday night to stare at the war memorial without ever lighting a candle or leaving flowers. A former bus driver swore he once saw Leon burst into tears when a child asked him if he was a soldier. And an old woman who used to teach second grade claimed that long ago, a man who looked very much like Leon had come to a parent-teacher meeting without speaking a single word, then left in the middle of the conversation. It wasn't proof, but it was something. And in a neighborhood like this, one stitched together by memory, routine, and just enough curiosity to keep old secrets alive, something was all it took. People no longer just passed by Mr. Leon. They looked at him, they watched him, some with pity, some with awe, most with silence. Because what do you say to a man who's been carrying a story for 40 years, a story no one ever asked him to tell? Long before the streets of Pittsburgh became his sanctuary, before silence became his language, and before the rhythmic sweep of a broom became the only prayer he still believed in, Leon Kowalski was a young man with a voice, a dream, and a reason to fight. And her name was Sophie. She lived 3 floors above him in a narrow tenement in Warsaw, where the war clawed at the windows like a cold wind that never left, and the fear in the streets had already begun to burrow into people's bones. He was 22, she was 19, and in a world unraveling faster than anyone could repair it, they clung to the only thing that felt real, the shared language of glances, half-smiles, and the letters he passed to her through the hole in the stairwell wall, written at night by candlelight, with ink smudged by fingers that trembled from exhaustion, hope, and the knowledge that time was no long. Ogier, something they could count on. His handwriting was careful, poetic, tinged with urgency. He wrote of liberation, of what the world could be once the war was over, and always, always, of her. He called her his reason, his north, his future. She wrote back with verses clipped from books she read by flashlight, with lines that folded themselves into the pockets of his soul. And when he joined the Polish resistance in 1943, it wasn't with the fury of the betrayed or the politics of the disillusioned, but with the quiet conviction of someone who simply could not allow the darkness to continue unchallenged, not while Sophie waited. In one letter he never sent, the ink barely legible in the rain-soaked paper he carried through the sewers beneath the city, he wrote that if he didn't make it back, she must remember him not as the soldier he became, but as the boy who watched her turn pages like she was playing piano. But love, no matter how fierce, could not shield them from what was coming. In August 1944, during the Warsaw Uprising, Leon was part of a unit assigned to sabotage German rail lines on the city's outskirts. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and unprepared for the brutality of what they faced. After 3 days without food and with ammunition down to a handful of bullets, his group was overrun. He was captured, hands bound behind his back with wire, rifle taken, name stripped. He was sent first to a prison camp and later transferred to a forced labor site in what is now southern Germany, where he spent 7 months shoveling coal, hammering steel, and watching men around him vanish from hunger, disease, or despair. They gave him a number. They stopped calling him by name. And somewhere in those endless grey days, something inside him closed, not shattered but sealed off, like a door you never open again once you learn what waits behind it. When the camp was liberated in the spring of 1945, Leon escaped amid the confusion, walking for days with blistered feet and bloodied palms, scavenging bread from burned-out homes and sleeping in barns with strangers too broken to ask questions. He returned to Warsaw a skeleton in his own skin, expecting at least to find rubble where his past had stood. What he found instead was silence. The building where he and Sophie had lived was gone, replaced by a pit of ash and stone. Neighbors were missing or unrecognizable. One woman, older, shriveled, blank-eyed, thought she remembered a young woman named Sophie being taken, wounded, to a Red Cross station. But whether she had lived or died, no one knew. There was no grave, no message, just air and absence. Leon searched for weeks. He asked at hospitals, shelters, refugee trains. He waited at the station with a folded letter in his coat and a photo of her, the last one he had, tucked inside the lining of his jacket. He stood in line to register her as missing, but when they asked for her birth date, his mouth wouldn't open. He left Warsaw as quietly as he had returned, heading west with no destination, no plan, and no desire to be found. He arrived in the United States in 1949, part of a post-war refugee program, and gave a name that wasn't quite false, but wasn't entirely true either, enough to pass. He chose Pittsburgh because someone on the ship had said the factories were hiring and the winters felt familiar. He took jobs no one wanted. He never spoke Polish again. Years passed. He kept the photo of Sophie in his jacket. He buried the rest of the war, the medals, the armband, the letters, in a wooded park on the edge of the city where no one would ever stumble across them. He told himself it was the last time he would remember. He told himself remembering would kill him, and so he chose silence. He swept streets not to clean them, but to stay in motion. He avoided conversation not out of fear, but because words felt like a betrayal of what had been lost, of who he had once been. Each morning became ritual, each evening a slow fade into invisibility. He kept to himself, not because he had secrets, but because what he carried could no longer be shared. Until one day, decades later, a photo emerged, and the past, which he had buried beneath years of concrete and routine, rose again like smoke from a fire he thought long since extinguished. In the pale grey of early spring, when Pittsburgh's streetlights still cast halos over damp sidewalks and the wind carried the faint scent of melting snow and oil from factories long beyond their peak days, Michael Granger, the high school history teacher, stood in silent anticipation, the wartime photograph cradled in his coat pocket like a secret flame, fully aware that the life he led would probably never be the same after today, because what he intended to do was not simply to return a relic to its rightful owner, but to reignite a story that might have been buried beneath decades of dust and unspoken sorrow. When Leon appeared, stirring the frost at his feet with gentle sweeps of his broom, the photograph felt heavier in Michael's hand. He raised it slowly toward the old man, who paused mid-sweep as though caught between two worlds, one of routine and survival, and one of memory and longing. And as the image changed hands, a shift occurred, not evident in movement, but in the quiet shadow that passed over Leon's face. A faint flicker that said the past, once contained, was spilling into the present. It was not a dramatic moment. There were no words shouted. Rather, there was something fragile in Leon's eyes, a recognition that this carefully stored artifact was not just proof, but proof that the silence he had cultivated, deliberately and patiently, had been undone in a single breath, and from that point forward, he did something he had not done in years. He exhaled, with the full weight of a life waiting to be remembered. Days later, Michael found a plain white envelope on his doorstep, with just one word in neat, flowing script: truth. Inside, he discovered a manuscript, long, steady, and filled with the kind of reflective sadness that felt like shared confession, written with the care of someone offering a piece of himself back to the world he had left behind. Words tracing a path through the ache of lost love, resistance, captivity, escape, and above all, the quiet, unspoken echo of Sophie's name carried across oceans and time. Me. Each sentence struck Michael as a tremor, because Leon did not boast of heroism, nor plead for pity. Instead, he crafted something more enduring, a testament to love that refused to die, to memory that persisted in the face of erasure, and to a man who, having lost everything, proposed this as his final gift, that someone somewhere must bear witness. Within hours, that testimony had entered the collective pulse of the neighborhood, printed in the local paper under the headline, "The Street Sweeper was a resistance fighter. His story refuses to stay quiet." In cafes and laundromats and bus stops, people read phrases aloud and passed photocopies under breathful reverence, because in an era when history was too often packaged in politics, here was an unvarnished, painful, beautiful human story, and it spoke to something more universal than anyone expected. Among those touched was a scholar in Chicago specializing in post-war Polish-American lives, who shared documents indicating that a woman named Sophie Bennett, originally Sophie Kowalska, had indeed survived wartime Poland, reached the UK via refugee channels, and ultimately made her way to the US. Working in libraries in Massachusetts and Ohio, living quietly until her passing in 1979, and leaving in her belongings a small handwritten poem that read simply, "If he lives, he will find me," echoing Leon's earlier words in a way impossible to ignore. When Michael placed that discovery in Leon's trembling hands, not the picture, not the objects, but an echo of a longing answered. The old man did not cry, but his silent tears were carried in the rise and fall of his chest, and the way he pressed the faded photograph against his heart, as though it was all he had left of a life that really began long before his street sweeping ever mattered. In the days that followed, Leon allowed something new. He agreed to sit in front of 30 students in the high school auditorium, not to lecture, but to be present, and through the expanse of that silence, he told his story. Not in loud declarations, but in carefully measured recollections, as though each memory was a tremor in the present and could only be shared softly. And when the session ended, one of the teenagers, a girl with quiet eyes, whispered to Michael that what she heard was not history, but humanity. And at that moment, theory became memory for a whole room. Shortly thereafter, Leon delivered a small wooden box to the city museum, inside which lay worn medals, a frayed armband, letters yellowed with age, and the photograph he had carried for so many years, his only unsilenced keepsake. And with them, he placed a silent request that the curator understood implicitly. Exhibit these not as relics of glory, but as fragments of a life whose quiet endurance deserved company. And so the museum created a modest display, low-lit, respectful, without commentary flashy enough to distract. Just a placard that read, Leon Kowalski, a life remembered quietly. And those who visited stood in that hush, seeing the ordinary broom beside extraordinary commitment. And for many, it was the first time they realized that heroism doesn't always announce itself, but can whisper through decades of street dust and memory. Leon's story, once nearly swallowed by his silence, grew into something communal, a reminder that the past doesn't vanish because it wasn't broadcast, and that remembrance doesn't require banners, only acknowledgement. And as spring turned to summer, Pittsburgh found in one nearly invisible man a testament to what it means to hold one's history, not in trophies, but in the quiet rhythm of sweeping and surviving, and in the conviction that stories kept in silence only wait for the chance to be heard, when someone finally looks with compassion and the resolve to listen. When spring had finally released Pittsburgh from winter's grey grip, when blossoms tentatively peeked through the cracks in sidewalks that had known too many winters, something subtle yet profound began to shift in Leon, not in his gait, which remained hesitant and measured, nor in the gentle way he continued to sweep the streets he had tread for decades, but in the quiet reappearance of warmth. In his eyes, as though the past had finally been given a space to exhale after years of being held down. He did not become talkative. He did not turn into the kind of man who sought applause or attention. No announcements were made. But there was intention in the way he paused now at the high school auditorium during assemblies, just long enough for someone to offer a polite nod or a hushed thank you from a student whose eyes reflected recognition rather than pity. And in that recognition, Leon understood that he was not invisible any longer, that his silence, once an armor, had become a doorway to empathy. A few afternoons later, he appeared quietly at the high school's front entrance, not to speak or teach, but to hand Michael Granger a small, worn wooden box, almost like a parcel, and inside were the relics of his former life, a tarnished medal, a faded piece of armband cloth, letters whose edges were brittle, and the only photograph that had survived decades of exile. When Michael looked down at the items, he felt a kind of hush that wasn't built on reverence or ceremony, but on the simple weight of someone trusting the world with their memories. In the museum's modest display case, those objects found a new home, not under spotlights or grand captions, but under diffuse lighting and a quiet plaque that read simply, Leon Kowalski, a life remembered quietly. And visitors moved through that exhibit in respectful silence, drawing closer as though proximity could translate empathy into action, scanning the medal's humble luster and the wrinkled photograph, realizing that what was being honored wasn't martial glory, but the even braver act of choosing to endure and remember. As summer stretched toward autumn, the city found gentle ways to carry Leon's story forward. At the school, every year, students placed fresh flowers beside his portrait in the hallway. These were not formal ceremonies, but unscheduled moments of memory, small acts beyond nostalgia, offering quiet continuity to a life once lived in fragments. Teachers told his story in classes not as a moral lesson, but as a testament to the hidden histories walking among us. And in literature and history classes, his narrative was woven into discussions about resilience, memory, and the personal cost of war. One crisp morning, long after most of the city had thawed from winter, a small bronze sculpture was unveiled near the public square. An older man, clasping a broom in both hands, leaning toward the ground in a gesture of steady care, with no grand emblems approving him, just his form etched in gritty realism. Below, in inscribed letters, were the words, Leon Kowalski, a humble legacy, thoughtful remembrance. No speeches celebrated heroism. There was only quiet applause, mingled with tears and nods from familiar faces who once passed him by without seeing. And a boy who had known Mr. Leon as a mute fixture in the dawn now read the inscription aloud and smiled, a moment of passage in which one silent life was remembered by those whose futures it had touched. Years later, after the bronze figure had become part of autumn's glow and the high school's routine, Michael walked past it one evening and noticed fresh chalk words at its base, written by a student. "Silence isn't weakness. It can be strength." He stopped. Many walked by without noticing, but some stayed to read. Some nodded. Some wrote similar thoughts in their journals. And thus, Leon's legacy became living, a phrase that invited more than mourning. It invited a quiet courage born of reflection. In the small park, where he had once buried his war relics beneath soil and grass that no foot trod often, a group of students excavated them in a respectful uncovering. They lifted them gently, as though handling fragile memory with reverence rather than curiosity, and delivered them wrapped in cloth to the school's archive, where they joined the permanent collection not only as artifacts, but as symbols of personal endurance and the necessity of remembering. By the time winter returned to Pittsburgh, bringing with it a hush of white across empty streets and the occasional clink of an ice scraper, Leon's health had begun to fail the way winter always does, in the bones of those worn by decades. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't make statements. He walked less, slept more, and spent his mornings within, the broom resting unused by the window, where a single candle burned next to a framed photograph of him and Sophie, torn and faded but still urgent. One night, in his small room whose window faced the quiet street he once swept, he passed away peacefully, the candle extinguished, leaving in its soft smoke the centuries of contained history, the grief and love and struggle, and the silence that was not absence, but presence, reframed. At his funeral, which was not vast but was full, there were no uniformed guards or radio announcements, only a simple wooden casket carried by students from his former school, mourners holding handwritten letters, not eulogies, but memories, of an old man who taught them about quiet dignity, of a stranger who stirred recognition, of a lost voice found again. In the square near the bronze statue, people halted in place, heads bowed, and one of the students read a single line: "He did not sweep to forget, but to endure." No trumpet played, no banners flew, just silence honoring silence, weighty, heartfelt, longer in memory than any spoken words. In the months that followed, his story drifted into books about Pittsburgh. Not the headlines, but the back pages, catalogued under local stories of uncommon courage. Tour guides pointed him out as a hidden gem of memory, and the statue became a waypoint for visitors seeking something beyond steel and history, a reminder that the quietest witnesses are often the truest. When Michael returned to teaching years later and asked his students why they remembered Leon, so many of them said the same thing, in different ways. Because he showed us that some stories are told not with loudness, but with endurance, with quiet, and with faith in being seen, bit by bit. And in that belief, fragile, persistent, enduring, Leon's life remained alive, no longer buried under his street broom or the dust of forgotten years, but held steady in the quiet conscience of a community awakened to what it means to recognize a survivor, a witness, and a man who once swept the streets in silence until at last his story was found. When you walk through Pittsburgh today, past the red brick facades, past the small cafes and second-hand bookshops that survived the collapse of the mills, you might, if you're paying attention, see a bronze statue quietly sweeping the pavement, positioned in a tucked-away square, as if reminding passers-by that not every hero speaks loudly. Sometimes the greatest witness is the one whose hands traced hope into the dust, year after year. His name is engraved below, Leon Kowalski, a humble legacy, thoughtful remembrance. In those words lives the quiet truth of a man who endured the unspeakable, who loved without apology, and who chose silence not to avoid the world, but to carry it with him, day after day, one rhythm at a time. At his high school, his framed photograph, broom in hand, eyes distant yet gentle, hangs in a hallway where students leave handwritten notes saying things like, "Silence can be strength." Edrit, in the city archive, his letters, his medal, the faded picture of Sophie, and an unburned candle are preserved not as relics of war, but as fragments of a soul who survived it and taught a city in the process how to remember. Leon left no fortune. He left no descendants, but he left something more enduring. Proof that stories can be stored in silence and given back piece by piece, until we see that the bravest lives aren't always the loudest, but the ones that continue quietly until we learn to listen. We publish new videos every day, true stories that touch and inspire. If this one moved you, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe, because silence only echoes if someone stays to listen.